Hello there. This is the second lecture for our marketing class. It aligns with module number 2 and the textbook reading for chapter 2. As you can see on the screen, we're going to talk about global, ethical, and sustainable marketing, as well as external macro environmental forces that will affect our marketing. So off we go. First, we want to talk about trade. Um, Trade is generally considered to be beneficial. Goods can be supplied by countries that are better and more efficient at production. And we know that certain countries are known for uh, producing high quality products in a certain product category. For instance, France is well known for producing great wines and perhaps some cheeses as well. And other countries are known for you know, high quality production of certain products. Um, and some are known for being much more efficient at producing certain types of products. So, and this means there's increased competition, which means there is, if we import and export, we'll have increased competition, which means lower prices, more variety, and in some cases, better quality. And I'm going to give an example of just two countries, keeping our model relatively simple. Two countries, Japan and Argentina. Japan is very good at producing electronics. That has been known for decades. Argentina is very good at producing various agricultural products. People may be aware of Argentinian beef and other crops that are produced in Argentina, and they do a very good job of that. On the other hand, Japan is not a good agricultural producer. In fact, they import, I believe, at least 40% of the food that they consume in Japan. If you think about it, it's a relatively small country with a large population. Land is at a premium, so they're not very good at producing agricultural products, at least on a scale to feed their own population. On the other hand, Argentina is not a particularly good producer of electronic products. There are a lot of other countries that produce them much better and much greater with greater efficiency and greater quantity. So we see that these two countries sort of complement each other. One is good at one thing, one is good at the other. They're each good at what the other is not in this narrow model. So therefore, electronics will cost more in Argentina, and the food will cost more in Japan, unless, of course, they trade. And so it's very important to these two countries to trade. Now, expand this across different countries and other product categories, and we see that trade is a very beneficial thing. There is, of course, downside of trade. Local industries may be hurt. For instance, if you are or sticking with our model, an Argentinian producer of electronics, your business is going to be hurt. If you are in Japan and you're, well, I don't know that it would hurt Japan as much because there is such a high demand for food and the supply there. But you can see that local industries in general can be hurt when better or cheaper products are imported. And this often leads to protectionism. And recently, we've seen a little bit of protectionism. President Trump has decided a while ago that the trade relationship with China was unfair, and I'm not making a comment for or against that decision. And as a result, there were some protectionist steps taken. There are, of course, embargoes. You can say we are not going to accept any more products from a particular country or of a particular type. That's a rather draconian step to take, and is usually only taken when there is a political element to it. Like, for instance, there are embargoes against Iran, not because of any economic reasons, but for political reasons. Probably one of the best, or most, maybe not best, but the most common tools for protectionism are tariffs. Tariffs are taxes that are put against any good that is imported. And so we'll charge them a tariff, which will raise the price, which will make locally produced goods and services, or locally produced goods cheaper, or well, more competitive against these goods. They're not, doesn't make the goods cheaper, but it makes the cheaper good that may be imported raises to a higher price. So it becomes much more attractive to buy locally produced goods, which kind of works against some of the things that we talked about in the previous slide. There are also occasionally anti-foreign goods campaigns where, you may have heard these years ago, buy American, and people say, I want to buy an American car, I want to buy American clothes, which is actually quite difficult in a broad sense, because so many of the goods in our country are produced overseas, whether in Mexico or China or India or wherever. I mean, you can buy American goods. We still produce goods here, but I often say, imagine you're in a classroom and all goods made in China magically disappear. Well, a lot of people would be quite embarrassed, because all of a sudden maybe some of their clothes would be missing. And I have seen, I remember back in the 80s, there was a anti-foreign goods campaign. And I actually worked I had a part-time job in a craft, a shop in Manhattan. It's called the American Country Store. And it had country goods, country crafts, things like that. And I remember bringing in a shipment of baskets that had just come in. And even though this was the American Country Store, I saw labels on the bottom that said made in China. So we would have had to get rid of that. Occasionally you'll see in some stores an American produced rack, a rack of goods that are guaranteed, or at least represented as being produced in the United States. And I'm sure you would have seen similar types of campaigns maybe in other countries. In general, however, these aren't as strong as you might think, because ultimately people do tend to want to buy better products at lower prices. And in certain cases, other countries in certain categories are able to do that, or provide goods that way. Because in general, protectionism, like through tariffs, raises the cost of goods, and people, tend to make decisions based on their pocketbook, and that's the way it goes. We do live in a world now that is very global. You can, for instance, see I bought a piece of machinery. Actually, it was a snowblower. About 6 months ago, and I get the instruction manual, and only about a quarter of it is in English, because the producers of that snowblower are shipping to many countries. So it's hard, to avoid globalism and global trade. If you wish to go global and want to produce your goods and find international markets for them, there's lots of decisions you have to make. One is, do you want to do it at all? It does take on extra complexity to sell into other markets, and that's the prime decision. Now, many people have said yes, many people have said no. More people, I think, will say yes if they're growing and being successful. They probably try to saturate their own country first, and then we'll move on to other countries. Other people will go global earlier. I actually, in my consultancy business, I do have a couple international clients, and I also license some of my intellectual property overseas. So it's and why should I give that up? Why not? So another decision is which markets to enter. You don't enter the globe all at once. You do it country by country, because there are different complications for each country that you're going to enter. And also decide what level of commitment, what amount of resources are you going to put behind marketing your products globally. And then how are you going to adopt your marketing mix? In the previous lecture, we talked about the marketing mix, also known as the 4Ps: product, price, place, and promotion. You will have to adapt many of those things. You will have to adapt your product in many cases. For instance, in the United States, Krispy Kreme donuts are known for having a glaze on them. But if you were to go to a Krispy Kreme in Mexico, they would have powdered sugar. The product, Krispy Kreme has adapted to local taste. So they've changed their product a little bit. Obviously, price will be different because it's a different currency. We'll talk more about that. Changing your distribution, obviously, is automatically occurs because you're dealing with different distributors in different countries. And your promotion, at the very least, the language has to be changed. So you will have to figure out how you want to adapt your marketing mix. Another thing is as you deal with, well, there's large organizations in general, but also as you go into other countries, are you going to try to maintain a centralized control, or are you going to allow for a lot of local adaptation? And that is a very complicated decision. It's not actually one decision, it's many decisions. And that's something you'd have to think of. I remember, for instance, when I worked at a certain pharmaceutical company, for the product group that I was working with, we had a very centralized control, and we decided that wasn't particularly efficient. We tried to localize control, and we allowed all of our subsidiaries in various countries make their own decisions about promotion. And we remember in New Zealand, there was one ad that was incredibly bad taste. I don't know what they were thinking. It was such bad taste, I won't even describe it to you. And all of a sudden we had to change. We all of a sudden went back to centralized control. And you'll often find in large organizations, it's kind of like an accordion. It expands to localized control, and then something happens and they pull it back to more centralized control, and it goes back and forth. And there are various reasons for that, which you would get to know more as you get in a large organization. Moving along, in terms of trade, there are all sorts of barriers that you will have to overcome. Obviously, there are social and cultural differences. I gave the example of the Krispy Kreme donut, with the powdered sugar versus the glaze. So products may have to be adapted. I remember in particular, there was a cosmetic company that got into a lot of trouble or had a great difficulty in Egypt. Egypt is a socially conservative country. And they had basically taken an American model and gave her all the eye makeup they had in the ad in America, and presented it, and they put in the Egyptian text and all that, and it was received extremely badly, and because it was seen to be a little over the top, where in the United States, not so much. So again, you have to understand the local sensitivities in your communications and in other aspects of the marketing mix. There are obviously issues of language, and that's not simply translating to the language, but within a language, there are very subtleties. There is slang and there's jargon, and you have to adjust accordingly. And this is where you really need a lot of local guidance. The values and attitudes, and that I think I touched on that when we're talking about the cosmetic company in Egypt. I give you another example. Maybe many of you may be familiar with the Got Milk campaign from a few years ago, where essentially in their advertising, the dairy board, which was promoting milk, created comic situations where people were without milk and it was uncomfortable. Somebody with large cookies and can eat the cookies, but there's no milk to wash them down, and some other things. The idea of you don't want to run out of milk. And they expanded this into other markets, and apparently particularly in certain Latin American cultures, running out of milk is not funny. The the Latina mother would be horrified to. They found actually there was a huge rejection of this comic premise, and so you have to understand these attitudes and these sensitivities. Excuse me. There are also economic differences. There's different infrastructures. For instance, in Africa, one of the big problems is a lack of infrastructure, whether it's roads or water or electricity, and this creates a lot of problems for trying to market certain types of products that require a certain amount of infrastructure. Also, there are issues of currency conversions and shifts in the exchange rate. That needs to be paid attention to. There are political and legal differences. Certainly, if you're going into a country that is having a lot of political turmoil, that could be somewhat problematic, as well as a different legal environment. For instance, in Japan, you cannot open up a company and have it foreign owned. It must at least be 50% Japanese owned. And there are other countries that may have similar types of restrictions. So you have to understand the approval processes for certain types of products will be different in different countries, and you have to get probably local people to address that and pay attention to that. And there's a lot of international regulation, and that ties in with the legal environment and shipping. How can things be shipped, and what are certain requirements, and so forth. So I mentioned a moment ago exchange rates, and that's the rate at which one currency can be exchanged for another. And that is affected by the demand for the currency, and the demand for currency is affected by the demand for products produced in countries that use that currency. So, and I'm just going to give a very simple example. Let's say I want to buy a box of English tea, and it costs 10 pounds. Okay, but I only have American money, so I only have dollars. So if I go in and they're going to say, no, sorry, we only accept British pounds. So I'm going to have to go and exchange. And let's say at a given point, the exchange rate is $1.50 for a pound. So if I want 10 pounds, it's going to cost me $15. So if I want that box of British tea or English tea, it's going to cost me $15. Okay, that's not particularly bad. Now, we'll give another example where the tea is still 10 pounds, but the exchange rate has shifted. And now if I want to buy a pound, it's going to cost me $1.75. This means now that box of tea costs $17.50, which may not seem like that much of a difference. However, if you're buying lots of tea and or you're importing lots of tea, that could be somewhat difficult, particularly if you've worked out your budget, and sometimes an exchange rate will severely hurt a deal. In some cases, some countries actually potentially can lose money if there is a sudden shift in the exchange rate that's not in their favor. Obviously, if the exchange rate went in the opposite direction, that would be no problem, but you cannot depend upon that. So, to deal with this problem, the European Union converted from all their various currencies, francs and Deutschmarks and lira, and I can't remember all the other currencies that disappeared when they shifted over to the euro. So it is a common currency used across Europe. And that is to essentially take out the risk of exchange rates. So, excuse me. Originally, the euro was going to be valued an equivalent of $1. Now that has shifted several times since they initiated the euro, and it will forever shift because, and some people have talked about maybe a common global currency. I don't see that happening in my lifetime, particularly after we've seen Brexit occur. Now, Great Britain actually did not use the euro. They stuck with British pounds. And so I don't know if we'll ever see a global currency. But maybe in your lifetime, I don't know. We do have significant global regions. There are regions that, trading regions, which there's a lot more trade. Europe, obviously, since they had the European Union, they were doing a lot of trade, and that was one of the impetus for the European Union. And obviously, the big players in Europe are the United Kingdom, Germany, France, and Italy. Others are there too, but these are probably the four most dominant players there. In North America, obviously it's the United States, Canada, and Mexico, and there's a lot of trade between these countries, as well as the Pacific Rim Asia countries: Japan, China, South Korea, the Philippines, Taiwan, and Malaysia. Obviously, Japan and China, and to a certain extent, South Korea are the most dominant ones. China, which at the time of this recording has the second largest economy, and since these various examples here where the countries that are geographically close, it's easier to ship between these countries than others. There are all sorts of trade agreements trying to make trade easier. I'm not going to go too much into detail here. We have the General Agreement on Trade Talks, which seemed to be always ongoing. The European Union, formerly called the Common Market, which we've just talked about, and the creation of the euro. The NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which was recently upset by, rejected by President Trump. Will NAFTA be restored, or some other equivalent be restored afterwards, after the Trump administration? I don't know. Then there's the Central American Free Trade Agreement, similar to NAFTA. And then the World Trade Organization, an organization that very purpose is to facilitate global trade. And there are criticisms of each of these, obviously, but the fact that they came into being shows a strong desire for human beings to trade across countries' borders or international borders. There are various ways to go global if you want to. The most obvious is import and export. Just find a buyer overseas and export to them, or to import from other countries if you think you found a market here in the United States. Another way is direct investment overseas, where you actually buy a business overseas. You invest in a factory and produce a product locally, or if you're in a service industry, let's say hotels, you buy hotels overseas and operate them. There are a lot of joint ventures. I mentioned a moment ago that you may not own more than half of a company in Japan. And so that would probably, I know that has led to a lot of joint ventures where two companies come together and operate a third business to hopefully to advantage. The last category here is licensing or franchising. Licensing is charging a fee for the use of some piece of intellectual property. Now, that might be a copyright or a trademark or a patent. I actually have lots of intellectual property that I license out: designs, photographs, books, things like that. I give other people permission to use my work in exchange for them giving me a fee. Franchising is a similar way. For instance, essentially you are allowing someone else to use your your name. For instance, McDonald's. The McDonald's Hamburger Corporation operates a lot of restaurants, but they also franchise. They also license out their name and their processes and a lot of their know-how to people. And so many times, actually probably 2 out of 3, I'm not sure if this number is still consistent, but roughly 2 out of 3 McDonald's are not owned by the McDonald's Corporation. They're owned by a private operator. However, they are very strict. McDonald's is very strict about how they operate that, as part of the license agreement. And this actually, choosing licensing is a somewhat lower risk way to conduct business, particularly overseas. You license to another company. Now, you are admittedly risking your reputation. Let's say McDonald's, let's say there's one operator of a McDonald's that decides they're going to do whatever they want. They're going to offer substandard products. They're going to do things, create their own menu. And obviously the McDonald's Hamburger Corporation would try to stop that. But their reputation could be damaged somewhat. And we've seen this, for instance, one franchise chain that has been hurt a lot is Jack in the Box. They've had a couple cases of, I believe it was E. coli or other diseases that have gone through their operation. Now, most Jack in the Boxes are probably operated fairly well, but a couple of them were operated poorly where disease got through. So you would probably, I'm less likely to stop at a Jack in the Box because their reputation is hurt. However, financially, it's a lower risk in pure financial terms than import or export. For instance, if I can license out my patents or my trademarks or copyrights, I'm not actually giving up. It doesn't require capital to do that. Somebody else is providing the capital. So therefore, the risk is there. The same with direct investment overseas or a joint venture. Usually you're putting up money. Here you're just putting up your intellectual property. So it's actually a lower risk way of going. Of course, you have less control. So that, of course, is a problem. But financially, it is a lower risk way to produce. Excuse me. I mentioned centralization and localization, local control and central control. And here I'm kind of talking about similar things, standardization of a product. It does provide a more consistent branding. Again, McDonald's, I've been around the world and I've seen McDonald's in many countries. I actually, in Buenos Aires, one afternoon I was out with a friend of mine. We were traveling. We had a day off, and we decided to walk around the city. A beautiful city, by the way. And we saw McDonald's. And it's not that we had an urge for McDonald's or anything American. We wanted to explore, but we were both curious as to how close to our American McDonald's would this one be. And actually, we could only find 2 differences. One was the language. Obviously, it was all in Spanish, and the other was the potatoes were a little bit different. But everything else that we had seen was exactly the way it was in an American McDonald's. So their McDonald's has a highly centralized, standardized control over its brand. But there is, of course, the issue of localization, just like I mentioned with Krispy Kreme, putting powdered sugar in Mexico on their donuts as opposed to glaze. You will connect better with customers in your local market if there is a certain amount of localization. Obviously, you want to change the language, if it's appropriate, change the offering. But of course, you're going to have less consistent branding then, and that's something that has to be wrestled with. Okay. All right. I kind of want to move on to another area now and talking about the macro environment. Previously, I spoke about the marketing mix, and these are the control levers. These are the decisions you make. But there are things that are beyond our control. Think of it like a sailor with the wind. they don't control, a sailor doesn't control the wind, but has to deal with it, either take advantage of it or try to reduce any damage it might do to its vessel. And there are a number of categories here. Obviously, there are economic forces, natural forces, technological forces, legal and political forces, social and cultural, as well as demographic. And I'm going to go through these all in much more depth right now. But these are sort of 6 forces. I think maybe in the textbook they have it listed as 5, and demographics is often tucked under social and cultural forces, and that's fine. But looking at economic forces, and these are things we don't control. There are various measurements that we have for judging what is a good economy. The first is productivity. How much, and one of our best measurements is GDP, or gross domestic product. How much product is being sold, being produced and sold. We used to use a measurement called gross national product, but as we started trading more, that became a less relevant measurement. It was like what's produced by an American company. Well, if they're producing it mostly overseas, is it really as good a measurement? So we've gone with gross domestic product. So if another country owns a factory in the United States, we include their productivity as well, and don't include an American company overseas producing in another country. So gross domestic product, and you hear this used, people talking about GDP a lot, and this is a very important measurement. Stock prices, which is not always as relevant, but it is another measurement, and it's a very easy number. It's a number that's constantly being broadcast on the business channels. What is the Dow at? What is the NASDAQ at? And that is an expression of how well companies are valued. And you learn a lot more about that in an economics class or in a finance class, but it is a measurement that we generally want to pay attention to. Another one is the employment level. If you have high unemployment, that means you have people who are not working, who are less likely to buy products, because when you have a limited budget, obviously you can't buy as much. Fairly simple. So we like low unemployment levels, or high employment levels, or low unemployment levels. We also want to look at wage and salary levels. Let's say somebody is making $30,000 a year. Well, if they're still making $30,000 a year 10 years later, they're actually making less because of inflation. That's how we value currency. We can buy, because with $1, you'll be able to buy less. I remember a candy bar costing 5 cents. Now, is it that candy bars are become that more expensive? Well, in one way, yes, but also salary levels have gone up. And so this is actually there is a lot of talk about raising the minimum wage. Are wage levels high enough? I'm not going to get into sort of the politics of that particular discussion, but that is, if you're in a country that has high wage levels, that's good. Of course, that has other implications. If I have high wage levels, maybe I want to produce in another country, and we get back to talking about trade. So we have to be aware of these measurements altogether. We also, looking at GDP, we're looking at something called the business cycle, sometimes called the economic cycle. GDP goes up and down. When it's increasing, when it's the amount of goods being sold increases, we call that's the growth phase. That's the growth part of the cycle. And generally we like that. That's good. That means prosperity is coming. And at some point, however, you're usually going to reach peak prosperity, where an economy overheats. It produces too much, and for whatever reason, and we can get into all sorts of economic analysis here, growth is just not sustainable. We can only grow so fast, so far, so fast. And then usually what happens is there is a decline. And if this decline goes on for too long, we call it a recession. And there's a very specific definition for recession. A recession is when we have had a reduction or a decline in GDP for 2 straight quarters. Not 6 months, 2 straight quarters, the first quarter, second quarter, third quarter, fourth quarter. So we have to be going down for 2 straight quarters for it officially to be a recession. Now, at the time I'm recording this, it is June of 2020. Because of the pandemic, a lot of people, employment has gone down, GDP has dropped. We have had a major decline, very steep decline. I think it's usually we don't know you're in a recession until the recession is over, because you have to record that 2 quarters worth of data. But I think it's pretty safe to say that we're in a recession right now. This is probably the most unusual recession, and it's not because of wasn't triggered by any fundamental problem in the economy, but rather a biological problem, the coronavirus. So we will probably have a recession. Now, some recessions are very deep, some are very mild. In 2002, we had a recession, but it was fairly mild, didn't last very long. It lasted the 2 quarters, but which is equivalent of 6 months, but it came back. Around 2009, we had a very deep recession, and it lasted a little while longer, far more than 2 quarters. If we have a truly sustained recession, we tend to call that a depression. Now, a depression doesn't have a specific definition in terms of length or depth. However, we do refer to the 1930s as the Great Depression because it was a long, sustained drop in GDP. Probably they're measuring GNP, but productivity, economic activity had declined considerably. Not that there wasn't economic activity going on. I mean, the Chrysler Building and the Empire State Building were built during the Great Depression. However, most people didn't participate in that particular economic activity. So are we going to have a depression? I don't think so, mainly because we don't really have a very good definition for it. But obviously, again, I'm talking from June 2020. Recently, we've seen some opening up of of businesses again. And so the question is, are we going to return to the growth phase? That is what the president has promised. We will see. Obviously, in this particular case, we're worried about a reoccurrence of the pandemic, a second wave. So I don't know what will happen, and that's one of the problems with economic predictions. You don't know. You have a sense. Generally, I think things will improve. It may falter a little bit in the fall when we may have a recurrence of hopefully a milder recurrence, which is actually very similar to what happened with the Spanish flu roughly 100 years ago. It came in waves. It actually lasted a couple of years. I don't think that will happen in this case, but and I've kind of gotten off the topic a little bit about business cycles. However, it is related, and so we need to look at that and see what happens. So we do have business cycles. Now, this is a nice sort of clean line. In actuality, the business production is erratic. It's not a nice, it's often very jagged, probably more jagged than this particular curve here. What we would prefer is smoother lines where there are not big jumps up or down. While we do like growth, I think slow growth in some cases is a lot healthier than the economy burn out a little quicker. So I think slow growth is probably better. It's more comfortable. There are obviously those people who want fast growth because they want to make profits, and that is perfectly understandable. So that's something we have to try to manage. And we do have various tools for the government. The government has various tools. They have monetary policy as well as their fiscal policy, but that's getting more into macroeconomics, which is not the subject directly of this course. In general, the demand for most products increases as the economy improves. As the economy improves, people get jobs. If they feel they're doing well, if they think the future is rosy, they're going to start buying things, buying products, going out and eating, entertainment. So generally, as the economy does well, as you go into that growth phase in the economic cycle, most products will increase in demand, and which is actually part of the recovery or part of the growth phase. And obviously, if you turn that around, the demand for most products will decrease as the economy declines. Even if you haven't lost your job, you may be worried about losing your job and therefore pull back on what you're going to spend your money on. And that actually adds to the decline. It's the fear of a decline that actually accelerates a decline. That's why in 2002, when we had a mild recession, President Bush came out and said, go shopping. We don't have to worry. The fundamentals are good. I don't remember what he specifically said, but he said, go shopping. And that actually helped because that generated more economic activity. So as we can control the economy as a population, but as individuals, we can't. So we have to hope that people will spend more money in general. However, there are some exceptions here. The demand for some products actually increases as an economy declines. Now, this seems completely counterintuitive. For instance, low-cost substitutes. So instead of let's say I want to go out for lunch with a friend, instead of going out to TGI Fridays, I go to McDonald's where the prices are lower. Actually, in the 2009 recession, McDonald's did very well, specifically for that reason. Actually, it was the high end of their menu, higher price part of their menu that did really well because people, instead of going to higher priced restaurants, came to McDonald's. So lower cost substitutes. So instead of buying steak, you might buy hot dogs. You still have those needs, and they have to be met, but you meet those needs with lower cost items. So lower cost substitutes. However, it's not just lower cost substitutes. You will also see an increase in demand for things like alcohol, tobacco, antidepressants. When people are depressed, what do? They drink, they smoke, they take drugs of both legal and illegal varieties. You see that. Also, in a recession, and this might seem odd to you, there is an increase for education at the 2-year school level, not at the 4-year level. I've actually worked at 2-year schools and 4-year schools. And actually, I was working at both during the 2009 recession. And I saw one school I worked for went from an enrollment of 9,000 to an enrollment of 13,000. That's a huge jump. Meanwhile, the 4-year school I was working for is actually a university, actually declined in enrollment. And just a little bit, not a lot. Why is this? Well, first off, yes, you could say, well, 2-year schools are cheaper, but also people felt, okay, I can't get a job, so I need to improve my skills. I don't have a degree, so maybe I can get a quick degree. In fact, one school I know of that I actually worked at, they specialized in 18-month degrees. You didn't take the summer off. And the idea is they would try to get you through an entire associate's degree in 18 months. Kind of a rough schedule, but in a recession, that's probably what you want. So, you know, every situation is a little bit different. So we also have natural forces, again, things we can't control. Obviously, the weather, hurricanes, rain, um, snow. There's no control over that. And also part of nature and related to weather is seasonality. You know, we know when it snows. We know when it's likely to snow. We know when it's probably not, definitely not going to snow. And this will affect products that we might buy, such as, you know, bathing suits or snow blowers or a whole bunch of products, you know, wearing lightweight clothing as opposed to heavyweight clothing, will be affected by the seasonality. You know, ice cream, for instance, tends to sell better in the summer for obvious reasons. Um, Pollution, while that pollution is not technically natural, it is putting something into the environment, and that can affect things. For instance, the amount of pollution in Beijing almost prevented the Olympics there a few years ago. They actually had to shut down factories for weeks ahead of time, and they had to clean their waterways where they were going to have events of all the muck that had accumulated there. So, uh, also biology in general, and normally I have a little trouble explaining this to people because they don't quite get it, but things like, you know, disease, um, pests and parasites. Pests and parasites will affect, for instance, crops and livestock. Um, you know, and obviously we are currently, at the time of this recording, we are experiencing a pandemic in which the demand for products has shifted significantly. The huge demand, obviously, one of the products that are most demanded are the face masks. I mean, I never really wore a face mask until the pandemic came. People, you know, if you wore a face mask, people think you were a surgeon. Now it's quite normal. Obviously, the demand for a vaccine will be very high once one is available. The demand for other products have dropped. Um, the demand for Zoom and other teleconferencing services has increased. So, um, and this is the thing about macro environmental forces is they can be very good for something that's generally negative, generally bad, um, can hurt the demand for a lot of products, but increase the demand for others. So, well, it's also a little complicated in that a lot of things have been shut down by the government. But even when they're opened up again, um, for instance, there's not going to be a lot of demand for going on cruises where you're trapped with people and you can't get away from them and you're, you know, contact with them, or other gatherings. There'll be some demand for it, but not, you know, too much. So it's great for the people who manufacture these sort of things, you know, the PPE, personal protection equipment, people who do Zoom and GoToMeeting, and a lot of other products, you know, telecommunication products, but very bad for others. So obviously natural disasters in general that are usually localized. For instance, if there are the forest fires in the western part of the United States has created a huge demand for firefighting equipment. That makes sense. From the actual equipment that the firefighters use to the planes that drop fire retardant chemicals on fires. There's a special type of helicopter, I believe it's a Sikorsky helicopter. It actually has a huge hose on it, and that goes out over the Pacific Ocean and literally dips, it's like a snorkel, dips the snorkel into the water, sucks up the water, then goes and drops the water on fires. So the demand for certain products is generally a negative thing, but for certain areas, certain product types, it is a positive development. Hurricanes increase the demand for plywood. If a hurricane is coming, you You want to get that plywood over your windows. And if your house is knocked over, you'll need plywood to rebuild it. This is not a natural disaster. Well, I'll get back to this other thing I was going to talk about. Actually, it's interesting. Walmart actually has on its staff a meteorologist, someone who tracks the weather. And they've learned when a hurricane comes into an area, there's a huge demand for certain products. Now, there are certain things that are obvious, like water and generators and gasoline and batteries. But also they've learned by tracking the data, there's a huge demand for Pop-Tarts. And people laugh when I say Pop-Tarts, but if you think about it, it is, in its packaging, it is waterproof. It has that foil packaging on the inside. You don't need to cook it. Even the finickiest child will eat it. It's sort of like in the military, like an MRE, meals ready to eat kind of thing. So there's huge demand for Pop-Tarts. And they track, so they track that, the hurricanes, and from their experience with supply chain management, they understand that certain products are going to increase in demand and they better deliver them there. There are also social and cultural forces. Obviously, every culture has its own customs, its own attitudes about certain products. And I mentioned cosmetics in Egypt and other things. I actually had an experience in the pharmaceutical industry. We very effective. It was actually an anti-parasitic. That's not so important, but it was an injectable product, and our research people had come up with a topical product. And the idea is that you could put it on the skin, rub it onto the skin, and that would be the equivalent of injecting it into the body. Now, most people don't like getting injections. Most animals don't like getting injections in general. So a topical product would be a huge advantage. And we went to launch this globally, and the head marketing manager in Brazil said, "No, we don't want to launch it." And we said, "No, but it's a great product. Why wouldn't you want to launch it?" I said, but in the attitudes in Brazil is, if it isn't injected or if it isn't a pill that you put in your mouth, it's not medicine. If you have a rash, that's one thing, but to put, it's like putting aspirin on your skin. That was their idea. And we said, no, it really works. And the head of our division said, wagged his finger, said, "You will launch this product." And they did, and it didn't work. The product worked, but it didn't sell, because there were attitudes in Brazil that unless it is an injectable or a pill, it's not medicine. So, and we probably wasted a lot of money launching in Brazil. But I talked about previously about, another attitude is about collectivism and individualism. In the United States, we are very individualistic. It has to do with how we came about as a country. People who were not happy with where they were immigrated to the United States, and they were. You hear the people who were self-made. Well, nobody's really self-made, but the idea is that you through your own merit, through your own work, you build up, and you build up a life, and you have the right to control it. And we are very individually oriented. However, other cultures are not. They're more collectivist. These are people who say, well, what's best for the group is what we'll do, as opposed to what's best for me. Many Asian cultures are collectivist. So that's important to talk about, or to explore when you're trying to promote a product, or even design a product. There are also morals and taboos. Certain things don't go over well. For instance, in some cultures, this is usually easier when I do it in a classroom. If I were to hand you a piece of paper with my left hand, that would be offensive because, and this applies to various cultures. I know Korean as well as some Middle Eastern countries have this reluctance to use the left hand, and it has to do with ancient living where we're eating from the communal bowl, and the left hand was for personal hygiene, and you never mix them up. And so the right hand was for community, and the right hand was for something personal, and not So actually, in certain ancient cultures, if somebody was to be punished, they would cut off the right hand, and that way you'd be forced to feed yourself with your left hand, which meant you could not participate in the communal bowl, and which I thought was kind of interesting. And and it's interesting. I would go to my son's workplace. He worked for a Korean gentleman, and his name was Kim, and Mr. Kim was always very nice and very glad to see me. I'm not sure why. And he'd always extend his right hand, but he would put his left hand behind his right elbow. And I always thought that was very strange, but he was like trying to protect me from his left hand. And that was just a custom. And you have to do that. In other cultures, to show the bottom of one's foot is considered insulting. I think particularly in Middle Eastern cultures. During the Iraq War, it was discovered that Saddam Hussein had put the first President Bush, a mosaic of President Bush's face on the floor in one of his palaces. And that would seem like a strange gesture, to immortalize an American president in one of Saddam Hussein's palaces. But the idea was that you would walk on his face. That was considered a great insult. So you want to be aware of any taboos or morals, things that might go wrong. Do that. We also have various family structures that are changing. For instance, just some examples, the acceptance of the gay lifestyle. If you went back 20, 30, 40, the further back in time you go, the gay people were essentially mistreated, had to closet themselves. Now we have, I'm not saying everything's perfect for gay people, but we have gay marriage, gay adoption. It is accepted. We see gay people living very normal lives in various entertainments, television shows, and movies, and so forth. So that is a huge shift. In some parts of the world, it is still unacceptable. You go to Russia is particularly homophobic, unfortunately, and other countries as well. So that is a cultural difference that you would have to pay attention to, both in our country and certainly in the American South. Gay culture is not as embraced as it might be. There's also a lot of concern about the environment, and this is a change as well. Used to be people didn't give a damn about the environment. There was a lot of pollution, and any concern about pollution back then was, well, could it get into our local water supply? That was a very limited concern. Now we think much more globally about global warming and the ozone layer and in general, which I think is a good thing. Actually, both of these are very good things. Occasionally, there are concerns about various diets. I remember a couple decades ago, there was a huge trend, fad about you must have a low-carb diet. Don't eat bread, don't eat pasta, don't eat any of these things. And actually, I remember there was a bakery in New York that had been in business for 80 years, and in a year it went out of business because everyone in the area all of a sudden adopted the low-carb diet. There was concern about trans fats, which I think actually is more legitimate. But there you will see various diet trends occur over time. I mean, years ago, I mean, for instance, the deep frying. When I grew up, everything was deep fried. Now, that's much less so. You see that mostly in fast food places. This is actually an interesting one, which um, if for some reason I were to give you a birthday present, I would go into my attic. I would find some wrap. Hopefully, it wasn't Christmas wrap, and I would just wrap it with whatever I found. That was most appropriate. Not so in Japan. In Japan, um, the gift wrap is considered just as important as what's inside. It's the way it's presented, and there's some Japanese gift wrapping um, that is beautiful, and this is from the same culture that gave us origami. So this eloquent and elegant and intricate folding of wrapping paper is a beautiful thing. Excuse me, and that's not something you would see in other cultures, perhaps. So um, this is also ties into demographics, which I'll talk about in a moment. China has something called six pocket syndrome, and this has to do with it. Kind of started with Chairman Mao many decades ago. He was the leader of China, and he envisioned, had a political agenda that by the year 2000, one out of every two people on planet Earth would be Chinese. That was his objective. And how do you achieve that objective? Well, through procreation, you tell your people have lots of babies. And after Mao passed away, that this policy continued, and then the new leaders of China said, "Wait a minute, we got a problem here. We have to feed all these people. We have to clothe them." And that was very difficult. And China has the largest population in the world. It had a large population before, but it really became quite difficult. Now, as you probably are familiar, China had adopted the one-child policy. If your parents, you can only have one child. Now, if you have a child, and I don't remember the details of it, but you could have a child, and if the child died relatively soon, you could have another one. But after a certain age, you're not allowed to have another child. Very authoritarian, not pleasant. Although I do understand the reason for the policy. Well, if you think about this, it creates a certain problem, and I usually do this on the board. So let me switch to the whiteboard here. Okay, so many of you are familiar with the family tree. Well, here's a person. I'm sorry, I'm not a very good drawer here. And here are the parents. Okay, so there's a mommy and there's a daddy. Okay, but this has gone on for a couple generations. So the mommy has some parents, and the daddy has some parents. Okay. Now, if you look at this poorly drawn diagram, you will see that, well, there's something missing. There's actually a number of things missing. Obviously, there's no siblings. This also means there's no aunts and uncles. They just don't exist. So now, let me explain something happened in my personal life. When my first son was born, this was the first grandchild for my parents. For my in-laws, they already had two grandsons, so it wasn't as big a deal. So the first Christmas after our son was born, we come in and it's to my parents' house, and it was like FAO Schwartz, the toy store. I mean, they just went nuts. They absolutely went crazy. In fact, it created some tension because we couldn't even put all the gifts into the car. It was that, we had a small car, and we just could not absorb all these. There was a rocking horse, I mean, a small one, and there was some other stuff, and they just went nuts. And we had to have a talk with my parents saying, you can't keep doing this, we don't have the space. And they said, well, it's our first, all right, it was their first grandchild, the first Christmas, so we get it. Okay. But imagine now, if this were the only grandchild they would ever have. Look at these grandparents. This grandchild is the only one they will have. This is the only child the parents will all have. So actually, this created a huge demand for special gifts because there's a certain competition going on between the parents and the two sets of grandparents, and defining gift that this child will love and remember them by, and it's a certain status thing going on. And that's sort of an interesting, that's created demand for really great gifts for children. So, and so get back to PowerPoint. So, this is sort of one that's sort of a result of a political as well as a demographic force. The last one I have, is Euro Disney. Euro Disney is interesting. Well, I assume that many of you have been to Walt Disney World in Florida, or maybe you went to the one in California. If you went to the one in Florida, and Disney certainly noticed this, that a lot of people were coming from Europe, not just in the United States, but a lot of Europeans were coming. And this is, if you think about this, they paid not just the high price to get into the park, but they also paid for a transatlantic ticket, and they had to pay for hotels. And so they must really like Disney. So Disney thought, wait a minute, what about those people in Europe who want to come to Disney, but they're not quite willing to pay for a transatlantic plane ticket? So they got the idea that they would open up another Disney park, but in Europe. And it was called Euro Disney, and some of you may be familiar with it. And they found a location about an hour outside of France, and they opened it up, and it was a disaster. And part of the reason is they didn't identify, they didn't integrate with the local culture. For instance, a family might come to Disney with a picnic basket, because that's apparently a big French thing to go for, bring a picnic basket, picnic lunch. Oh, no, they say, sorry, monsieur, mademoiselle, you cannot bring your food into it because you have to buy our really expensive Disney food, where a hamburger costs 10 euros or whatever it is. So this annoyed people. Also, you couldn't drink. Now in France, they're known for their wine. Oh, no, you can't bring wine. Disney is non-alcoholic. It's a family place. Well, that's a completely different culture from the French culture and many of the other European cultures. So Disney actually had to refinance. They almost closed it down, but they figured out, and actually they made it so they made a section of Disney available for people to bring picnic lunches. They started serving alcohol, wine and beer in Euro Disney, and they kind of saved itself. And Euro Disney got a very bad reputation for, shoving a piece of American culture into the middle of France and not doing well. Since then, for instance, I believe Disney has opened up a park in Shanghai, I believe. But before they opened it up, they checked with the local culture. They learned it, and they learned about feng shui. And I'm not sure if it's Shanghai, maybe Singapore, but I don't remember exactly. But the point is, it didn't have the negative waves that Euro Disney had, because they actually adapted to the local culture, and that's very important. As a subset of social forces, there's also demographic forces. There are various generations. Generations like different things. Now, baby boomers, which you may have heard about, I'm sure you've heard about. These were essentially, stereotypically, the children of the World War II generation. Men who went, and women, but mostly men who went to war in Europe and in the Pacific, came back after the war, and they wanted to get jobs. They wanted to start families, and you will see this huge increase in the birth rate. And this is actually not uncommon in nature as well. When there's a big disaster, and you have to remember, millions of people died during World War II. So the birth rate goes up after any disaster. And so for the last, I guess, 70 years, well, 60, maybe 60 to 70 years, um, they're, they followed the baby boomers because there was this huge population group who were catered to. These were many of these people were the hippies in the 1960s, and then they they became computer programmers in the 70s, um, and and marketers have looked at this group because it was a really big target, and have provided products for them. When they when baby boomers started having children, that's when there was a huge demand for safety seats and automobiles that had the safety cage, because all of a sudden they had children. They obviously want to protect their children. Um, Follow that, there's the Generation X, the birth dearth, which is a smaller group, and then was followed by Generation Y. And there's been some arguments about who does Generation Y include the millennials or not. I'm not going to get into that. Actually, baby boomers are the only generation that's actually specifically identified as by the government and the census. Um, but if you look at going back to the baby boomers, what are they looking for now? Well, the baby boomers are getting quite old. They're looking for healthcare services. They're looking for, end of life services, whether it's hospice or maybe it's burial services. So now Generation Y is this other big group that is being followed. And different generations will want different things, different attitudes. They're like different cultures. So want to be aware of that. We've also seen the change in multi-generational family relations. When I think of my father grew up in a house with obviously his parents, but also his grandparents. And there were various uncles in the house at various times, living with him. So after that, in the 1950s, there's a prosperity, the idea of the atomic family, the nuclear family. It had nothing to do with atomic bombs or energy or anything. It was just the idea that it was just the parents and the children. That was it. Now we've recently seen a move back towards multi-generational families, especially as people are living longer. So, where parents will move in with the family. We've also seen increased diversity in society in general, in the workplace. If you went to a workplace 60 so years ago, mostly people will be of the same gender, of the same ethnic group. Now we see a lot more diversity there, and that's a good thing. Things are not perfect, certainly, as we've seen with the Black Lives Matter movement and other related incidents. Diversity is not easy, but it is there, and as we try to perfect ourselves into better people. But we've also seen increased education. If you go back again 60 years, most people did not have college educations. Not everyone had a high school education. My grandfather was the first in his family to get a high school education. My father was the first to get a college education. I was the first to get a master's degree. This makes my son very nervous. He thinks he has to go get a PhD now, and I said, that's okay, you don't have to. But the point is that there is now to be prosperous, the probability of needing a college education is much higher. You can live and be prosperous without one, but the trend is towards more education. And that makes sense. The world has become more complex. You might, and even people who are not getting formal education are still getting education in various other ways. So we also have legal and regulatory forces, obviously legislation, various types, by Congress, by the state legislature, your town council, they'll pass various laws. The executive branch will initiate various regulations, which is usually a refinement of the legislation that has been passed by the legislature. You also have liability laws and rulings that often come out of the courts, about who's responsible for what. And this, of course, changes a lot of things. We'll get into some details. And obviously taxes and tariffs, and taxes, the idea of a sales tax is nothing that special. However, if you look at certain cases, for instance, cigarettes are taxed at a higher level. That's because it is generally deemed, cigarette smoking is generally deemed to be a bad thing for individuals and society. And so there's an attempt to sort of make it less enticing by making it cost more. We've talked already about tariffs previously, so I'll move on. Obviously, there are political events. Excuse me. Political events of all sorts of types. Obviously, rallies, which we've seen rallies, and we've seen other things. We'll get more into that in a moment. Some U.S. examples of regulatory forces. There, in the executive branch on the federal level, there are various agencies. The Federal Trade Commission, the FTC, they're the people who bring us the truth in advertising laws, and they regulate a lot of business and commerce. The FDA is more specific to a couple industries, specifically it's the Food and Drug Administration. Having worked for a pharmaceutical company, I'm very familiar with the FDA. They approve drugs, and they have had a significant effect. For instance, I'm sure that you've all seen ads for various drugs on TV and online, and you may have noticed that they talk about what a wonderful thing the drug will do for you, but then also they talk about the side effects. May cause psoriasis or itching or terminal dandruff or whatever it is that it's trying to all these side effects. That was not an idea that the drug company had. That was required by the FDA. And I actually had a colleague who called up the FDA to ask a question one time, and within half an hour he was in the vice president's office and told if he ever called the FDA again, he would be summarily fired. We had a regulatory affairs department to do that. You don't poke the bear. It basically was the lesson there. Don't make the FDA look too hard at you. Not that we were trying to conceal anything, but the FDA can obviously has a significant effect on how well they decide whether drugs are approved or not and what level of approval they have. Next, the SEC is the Securities and Exchange Commission, and they deal with accounting rules, and they deal with how you communicate about financial securities. So if you're trying to sell stock, what are you allowed to say? And you may be familiar with insider trading, and they get into all that. The U.S. Postal Service, the USPS, actually has its own police force. Most people don't realize this. And for instance, if you, let's say in a brochure, you mail a brochure to somebody and it has a fraudulent claim, that's a felony because you're using the Postal Service to commit a crime or misrepresent. Anything that's misrepresenting is considered a crime. And there's a whole bunch of other agencies, the Department of Agriculture, the Civil and Aeronautics Board. Whatever industry you're in, there is a regulatory agency for you that you have to pay attention to. We talked about taxes and tariffs, and it specifically meant cigarettes. 9/11, which is an event I don't believe most of you remember firsthand, but it was obviously horrifying, but it did create the demand for certain products and services. For instance, the demand for security, the demand, at airports and in other places. I actually remember being able to get on an airplane without identification. I remember being able to go all sorts of places very easily. And now there's a huge demand for security guards and scanners and all sorts of things. And of course, obviously, it hurt air travel. I don't think air travel has ever been the same since. Obviously, it hurt downtown Manhattan. Even if you weren't in the blast zone of the Trade Center, people didn't want to come into that area, or they didn't want to. Like, for instance, restaurants. People didn't want to go to the restaurants in the area. They didn't really want to be there. They might come in to take a look at the wreck, the devastation, but then they get out. So that was a major effect. War in general is, if you consider that a political thing, obviously creates demand for certain products and hurts other products. This is one, maybe I should have given it its own slide: copyrights, trademarks, and patents. A copyright is if you create something. It could be a song, it could be a poem, it could be a book, a painting, a photograph, a piece of software, a sculpture, whatever. It is yours, and you have the copyright, and nobody can use it without your permission. And of course, you can charge for permission. You can license it, essentially license things out. So you can license other things out too. Trademarks, again, are usually the name and the logo of a particular product or company. For example, and nobody else can use it unless they have your permission. For instance, if my name were McDonald and I decide to open up a restaurant, I can't call it McDonald's because the McDonald's Hamburger Corporation already owns that trademark. Now, if I want to open up a hardware store and call it McDonald's, that's absolutely fine because there's no conflict there. So, and trademarks need to be maintained. They need to be, protected. You can actually protect your trademark by having the name and then putting a little TM, and you may have seen that. And if you want to register it with the government, you put the circle R there, and that gives you a lot more. You're basically having the government back up your claim to it. To copyright something, you have to put the circle C and then your name and the date after it. I'm a big defender of copyright since I have intellectual property that I want to defend. The last one, patents, is where you have an idea, an invention. You invent a process or something more concrete, and you have to register that with the government. And you have about 18 to 21 years, again, depending upon the product patent category. And nobody can use that idea or that invention until your patent expires. Trademarks actually last forever as long as you maintain them. Patents, however, do expire, and then anyone can use your invention. And actually, to file a patent, you actually have to provide the complete instructions on how to create or do whatever it is that you're patenting. And since it's a public document, your competitors can see it. They can see it and they can look at it, and you might give them ideas, but they can't actually execute that patent, whatever you create in that patent. But that doesn't mean they can't try to create variations and get around the patent. Actually, I remember I worked for a company. We had a drug called ivermectin, and it was patented. And our competitor looked at the patent, and they added a benzene molecule around a set of atoms to one end of the molecule, which didn't really do anything, but technically now it was a different molecule, and we called it the C25 advantage. It was at the C25 part of the molecule. I'm not a chemist, but and that's where they got around the patent. So. And you often see people ask, why do drugs cost so much? Well, it's because they're trying to recover their research costs, which could be as high as $1 billion. And they have a limited time to do it. And that's why the drugs cost so much. Once the patent is expired, that's when you start getting generics. It's essentially the same product or the same molecule. But now those people can sell it for less because they're not trying to recover massive research and development costs. Some local examples of regulatory forces, blue laws. You may be familiar with those. For instance, many municipalities, you can't buy alcohol on Sundays, or maybe Sunday morning. In my town, you can buy it on Sunday afternoon, but not Sunday morning. Bergen County is very heavy with blue laws. A lot of businesses are closed in Bergen County on Sundays. Actually, in the entire state of New Jersey, you're not allowed to sell automobiles on Sunday. And these have religious roots, but some people like them. Actually, I went to look for an automobile on a Sunday and discovered the dealership closed. I was shocked. I thought they were always open. And when I came back to the dealership during the week, he said, "Oh yeah, that's a blue law," And I said, he said, "I'm grateful. Otherwise they would have us selling on Sunday, so at least we get one day off." So. This example sort of amused me. It's something that was in the news several years ago. Apparently, a local municipality had an ordinance saying you cannot have a certain amount of window tinting on your automobile. And somebody from Florida, where they generally have a lot of window tinting because the sun's out all the time, was driving through that municipality and got a ticket. And it was kind of strange. It was an argued case. How can you manufacture vehicles for specific municipality ordinances? But some international examples, you may have a lot of price controls in certain countries. For instance, Norway is very heavy-handed with their price controls, particularly on pharmaceuticals. They tell you what you can sell your drugs for. In the United States, pretty much you can charge whatever you want. Germany, I'm not sure if this is still true, but it was. They had a law that said you were not allowed to discount except for 2 weeks a year. I don't know what happened to those 2 weeks, but France and Germany have a law, and this is that there's no pharmaceutical advertising allowed to consumers. You can advertise to the doctors, but that's different. And I ran up against this. I was actually putting up a website for a pharmaceutical product that was available in 8 markets. 2 of them were France and Germany. And I got the night before launching the website, I got a call from the director of European operations. And I never get calls from somebody that high before. I had never received a call from somebody that high before. And he said, "Oh, no, you cannot do this. You cannot include France and Germany." And I said, "Well, yeah, but I'm in America, and so is the server." I said, "No, you don't understand. They will punish us. They will, and he was right. And I just was not aware of these laws. And so I very quickly had to remove all those pages and all the links to those pages. So governments sometimes do restrict foreign investment. I think I mentioned Japan before. They restrict it to 50%. Sometimes in certain countries, and this hasn't happened, I think, in quite a while, where a country decides to nationalize an industry. Basically, the government just takes your factory and makes it a state factory. This was when there was a heavy push towards socialism, a militant version of socialism years ago. And you saw a lot of this happen in South America and in other countries. It has not happened quite as much, but that doesn't mean it couldn't. So something to consider as you're thinking about going global. Obviously, we also have technological forces. We live in a world of technology, obviously computers. You have no idea how much this has changed the world. Computer changed the world. I remember a world without computers. And, listen, I love computers, but it has changed things considerably. Obviously, the internet has changed things. I am able to do business with people around the world that I would not have been able to do a business with otherwise. So I love the internet. Um, Obviously, all our lives would be very different without it. Cell phones are amazing technology, and they're not just phones anymore. And we'll talk about that. Video conferencing. I've had this on the slide for years, but obviously, video conferencing in the last couple months has become people's lifeline, and that's a technological force that is advanced. And I think I'm going to do a lot more video conferencing even after this pandemic is over. And I think a lot of other people are. And we realize, I mean, I have saved an enormous amount on gasoline. I don't have to go to a physical classroom. I don't have to go meet with clients in a physical sense. I can do it virtually. And that's a wonderful thing. Even though people still will want to get out for social reasons, video conferencing will be a people, it's become very easy, and people will do it over telephone calls now. And we also see a technological convergence of different technologies that are being integrated. I mentioned the cell phone, but most of you will call them smartphones. You think of all the functions that are in there. It's not just a phone. I mean, it does that. It also has a video camera, a still camera. It has GPS. I have on my phone an app that measures how many steps I take, how many times I go up the stairs, how many miles I've walked, which is great for monitoring my health. I can browse the internet. I can engage in social media. Actually, there is an app in this phone that allows me to. I could measure something. I could actually scan something and measure it. There's actually, I'm not sure if this phone has it, but there are apps that will allow you to actually scan 3D objects, pass that file to a 3D printer, and print that object. I mean, all sorts of technologies all being integrated in one little device. And that is, it's amazing, obviously. It may not seem amazing to you, but I didn't grow up with, I'm not a digital native. You, I presume, are all digital natives. You never were in a world that didn't have this technology. And the technology in the future will come and it will amaze you. I don't know what it'll be. Will we have Star Trek transporters? Will everyone have multiple 3D printers in their homes? We don't know. And it's actually hard to come up with what else could we put in this device. Actually, there is one app I love. It actually tells me if I put if I could put it on an object, it'll tell me if it's level. I'm not sure what the use that is, but I think that's kind of a cool app. Excuse me. The area of DNA and genetics are expanding, and we need to be aware of that. DNA will allow new types of cures and treatments in the medical field. Generally, the approach of medicine for the last several centuries has been to find a cure or medication that can be applied to everyone. And because that made sense. And doctors have known for a long time that, well, not every drug works on everyone perfectly the same way. But now with genetic analysis, they can start to tailor drugs for certain types of genetic groups, or understand who this drug will work for and who it won't work for. In terms of genetics, they're talking about having genetic fingerprints, not an actual fingerprint, but your genetic code will be your key. It'll be your password for things. Obviously, that's not a fully developed technology, but it could be coming. And that certainly affects the way we do things, how we can market. It'll also put certain technologies out of business. You know, the fax machine. I used to actually have a fax machine on my shelf back there. I haven't used a fax in a long time. I finally threw out my fax machine. So, okay. And that pretty much covers the macro environmental forces. Now, by the way, when I say environmental, I don't necessarily mean the environment in the way, in terms of our ecological environment. It could be a financial, economic environment, our legal environment. So don't, understand that distinction, especially when the exam comes around. Chapter 2 also discusses business ethics a little bit, and I would encourage you to read that section very carefully. I'm not going to go into it quite in the same depth, but it's important to understand that ethics is not the same as legality. Often I hear people talking about business ethics. Excuse me. Often I hear people talk about business ethics and then they talk about a whole bunch of legal issues. We will talk about legal issues, but essentially, this is like the golden rule. Treat others the way you would want to be treated. You know, if you're dealing with somebody in business or somebody in your company, treat them the way you would want to be treated. We've obviously seen a lot of unethical behavior. We've seen to the point where it's actually gets to be illegal. The legal world is trying to catch up to the ethical world. What do we believe is right and what do we believe is wrong? And it's not always clear. There are admittedly gray areas, you know. We have a fiduciary duty to do what's best for the company financially, but that sometimes interferes with our duty to be a decent human being, to treat other people fairly, to treat customers fairly. When we get into legal areas, we talk about things like bribery. In some countries, bribery is far more common than it is in the United States, but that doesn't mean it isn't common in the United States. And we want to be very careful about doing that. And I have been offered bribes in the past, and I have turned them down. Did all my colleagues turn them down? I don't know. So, and you don't want to offer bribes, obviously. That's where bribe is where somebody is voluntarily giving money or some other consideration to somebody in exchange for an unfair advantage. Of course, sometimes bribes are demanded, so then it's not so voluntary. There is issue of industrial espionage, and I'm going to talk more about this later when we talk about information management, but that's obviously something you want to avoid. Pollution, to a certain extent, is legal. A certain amount is allowed because no process is pollution-free, or very few processes. Now, obviously, if there's a law, okay. And this is something that an executive that I knew had was reported to me what he had said. There was a discussion about a certain factory and that it polluted a certain amount into the water. And by law, they could not have what came out of the factory to have more than 0.03% of whatever this pollutant was. And they were putting out 0.06, twice as much. And this person who I indirectly reported to actually said to him, well, that's easy. All you do is double the amount of water you're flushing through the system. Essentially, he wasn't talking about reducing pollution, but just diluting it enough to get by legally. And I thought that was a very unethical thing to do. So, I mean, obviously, we're also in marketing. Obviously, we want to avoid false advertising. We want to avoid other unfair practices. There are things that are not necessarily marketing oriented, things like sexual harassment, things we want to avoid. And it is important that we avoid doing these and build a better world for ourselves. Unfortunately, people act in their self-best interest, and that can be somewhat counterproductive. And we also want to build a sustainable world. And this is where we sacrifice short-term goals and short-term benefits for long-term stability. And that's hard because a lot of people are compensated based on short-term returns. And I specifically remember I worked for a company that made a crop protection product, an insecticide. And what we found was that after a few years, the insects became immune to it, after 5 years maybe. And so what our scientists worked up a plan, came up with what's called a rotation plan. And the idea is that you use our product 1 year, then the next year you use our competitor's product, and the next year you use nothing, and then the following year you come back to our product and repeat the cycle. And I remember a certain vice president saying, well, that's fine, but I'm not reducing the sales targets. So he completely missed the point. And he was going to retire soon, so he didn't care about long-term sustainability. I've always been a little worried when you have certain executives who are too close to retirement to actually think about the long-term viability of a company or its products. So we are concerned about financial sustainability. Now, the example I just gave you of the insecticide, that was trying to maintain financial sustainability, not just environmental sustainability. The idea is that our product, these scientists were actually trying to create a way that our product, create a manner of giving our product, of using our product in which it wouldn't become obsolete in 5 years, that we could continue to get returns on that product for many, many years to come. And unfortunately, that vice president was a little too short-sighted for that. And there is, we want to be financially sustainable, because if we're not, then we're going out of business. So again, think more long-term as well. Obviously, environmental sustainability, because we all live in this world and we want to live in a world without pollution, and we want to be healthy. And this is an opinion of mine. I'm not stating this as a fact, but for instance, the increase in the amount of autism found in our society, if you look at the figures, it's going up. Now, part of that is detection, yes. But I personally believe, well, first off, it has nothing to do with vaccines, but I personally believe it has something to do with the increased amount of toxins in our environment. And I think there is a correlation there. Now, I'm not saying this with any scientific certainty. It is a personal opinion. It's a hypothesis that I think probably should be looked into, but it's difficult, I know, scientifically to prove that. In sustainability, you also want to sustain your reputation. You can destroy your reputation in a minute. You do something that is seen to be inappropriate, and people will remember that. And never trust you again. And it's very difficult to get your reputation back. And now I want to talk here about something called game theory, and this is not in the textbook, but I think it does talk about it kind of relates to ethics and sustainability. I don't even like the term game theory, but that is what it's called. And the idea is that games are often related to real life events. In fact, for instance, battle plans are often related to chess, or there's another game called Go. And some generals play Go, and some generals play chess. Go is I believe, an Asian game. And there have been commercial games, like Monopoly is based on the real estate market in Atlantic City, and there are other games that are based on real life situations and turned into a game. So game theory was developed by mathematicians. It's applicable to business as well as legal and other areas of study, I think genetics and others. But in fact, if you have ever seen the movie A Beautiful Mind with Russell Crowe, directed by Ron Howard, about a mathematician named John Nash, who'd done a lot of work on game theory. The most famous game in game theory is it's called The Prisoner's Dilemma. It had to do with two prisoners and the district attorney, and how it could get them to work against each other, having the two, like, let's say they're thieves, having them work against each other. I'm not going to present that version of The Prisoner's Dilemma, but rather more of a business-like one. We talked about pollution. So here we have two players who have each they have one choice to choose, either to pollute or not pollute. And depending on whether they pollute and not pollute, and depending on what their opponent chooses to do, determines their outcome. So let's say both of our players choose to pollute. They're going to put their pollution from their factory into the environment, and they suffer a little bit because they're all, getting each other's pollution. So we here at the bottom, you see the cost of each firm's pollution is 3. So it costs them 3 for each side. So their own pollution as well as the other people's pollution. So they'll both lose the equivalent of 6. There are no actual units here. This is just to explain a situation. Some people actually have difficulty understanding game theory, so I'm hoping I'm explaining it well here. All right, so let's say player A decides, I'm not going to pollute. We are not going to pollute our environment, but player B doesn't change their what they choose to do. Well, this actually helps player B because now there's less pollution in the environment. I mean, they still have their own pollution, but not so much in general. However, player A now is still suffering from the pollution, as well as they had to pay all the expenses of keeping their pollution from going into the environment. They had to change equipment, they had to change policies, they had to maybe hire extra people. So it actually costs them more to not pollute. The same thing is if player B chooses to be the one that doesn't pollute while A still pollutes, we see the reverse situation. So from this point of view, it's actually the returns on polluting are better, and it's better to get the other people to not pollute, but you continue to pollute. So you get some benefit from them not polluting, but you still get the benefits of polluting, at least financially. What if you get both of them not to pollute? So then we have a different set of values. Each of them, we now have no pollution, but it costs each of them $5 million or whatever it is to not pollute. Well, obviously, this scenario in the bottom right is much better than the scenario in the upper left, even if it's only by 1. However, this will not come around naturally because if you look at the actions of, let's say, player A doesn't know what player B is going to do. So if player A pollutes, they lose 6. They're down 6. But if they don't pollute, they're down 8. So it's better in that case, if player B continues to pollute, that it is better for them to pollute because they're only down 6 as opposed to being down 8. Now, if player B doesn't pollute, you look at their things. They're up 2 if they pollute and player B doesn't pollute. But if they don't pollute, they're down 5. So in each case, regardless of what player B does, it is better for player A to pollute. Now, I know this seems a little complex and it seems a little hard to comprehend, but actually, if you just look at one layer at a time, one row, the returns, even though they're negative returns, are more favorable if the company pollutes. Now, if you want to get to this preferred situation where neither side pollutes, either there has to be a contractual agreement or there has to be regulation where the government comes in and says, you shall not pollute. And it's important to understand, this is actually an argument for having a regulation. In fact, occasionally I've actually heard industry leaders say, please regulate us on this because we don't want to do it, but if we don't do it and our competitors do, we're at a disadvantage. So I know that's a little complex and that's not unfortunately in the textbook, but you want to think about that. Maybe that'll help you understand the actions of certain people or in certain industries that do things that you really don't understand and think are wrong. They are doing it in their best interest, and often it is regulation. I know certain people think regulation is bad, but regulation actually makes it certain regulations make the world a better place. Okay, I believe that is the end of the lecture. You have simulations to do. If you have any questions on any of the material, certainly read the chapter 2 in the textbook. If you have any questions, reach out to me. We can have a Zoom conference, or maybe I can answer your questions in an email. So, all right. Take care.